Hello, all. Just to make sure that we understand what this is going to be the video that finishes up the lecture from week one, Friday. Where we left off, we were going to begin talking about approaches to the study of dying and death. The first of those approaches is the biological approach, which is far and away the most direct. Since aging and dying is an inherently biological process, it makes sense to begin with this one. And to take a quote from the textbook, indeed, the biological approach is about life, yet life includes dying and death. We have, however, already noted in class that especially the American point of view isn't always ready to see death as the logical next step in the process of dying. Like we've said, we tend to think about it as something separate somehow. Next, we have the psychological approach. As you would imagine, based on the name, this examines dying from a developmental perspective, in other words, stages of life. It bases much of its argument on the unconscious portions of the mind. It looks at experiences of pain, emotional stages of dying, death anxiety, gerontophobia, that is the fear of growing old, and death denial and desensitization across cultures. Next, we have the philosophical approach, and there are some sub approaches or sub points to think about here. We are both thinking and being creatures, which means that the first that we want to think about is the existentialist philosophical approach, which simply begins with the premise that we must all face death. This could include philosophical, psychological, and religious aspects. Next, we have the phenomenological or phenomenology approach. This studies the thing itself. The phenomenological approach of the study of death asks what the experience of dying is to those who have experienced it. Now, clearly, this means that it has to assume the researcher will not share the experience or understand its rationality. However, the phenomenological sociologist must understand the logic of another's experiences based on the other's particular perspective. Following that, we have the anthropological approach. This is the study of rituals, that is, death rituals, which allow people to deal with death and celebrate life. It can reveal essential, fundamental social and cultural issues. One case to think of here is Native American versus the American understanding of the relationship between life and death. Physical anthropology can lean biological, that is, a practitioner might work with bones in their study of such rituals to determine age, sex, and other physical characteristics of those who were involved. Now we get to the sociological approach, which, as we've noted, is the main approach of the textbook. Because of that fact, we actually have four ways of breaking that down, or four approaches within the sociological approach that we want to think about. These are main theories. First, the structural functional theory, that is, social facts, institutions, and forces are the essential feature of society in its objective character. This holds that society is in a state of equilibrium and institutions operate on their mutual behalf. Next, and somewhat in contrast to the first one, is conflict theory. Conflict theory holds that social facts, institutions, and forces are all somewhat in opposition to each other. It looks at these things as being the essential features of society and its objective character. Society is in a state of imbalance and focuses on inequalities, and it's looking at the way that these things resolve or at least have to do with each other that gives us conflict theory as allowing us to make sense of things. Next, we have the social exchange theory. This is based on the individual. Its essential feature is looking at society and its subjective character. And last, symbolic interaction theory. And again, this is individual based, looking at the essential feature of society being its subjective character. First, looking at the social exchange and symbolic interaction theory, we have the idea of the self fulfilling prophecy. This is an interactionist change theorist idea. Social facts do not have any inherent meaning beyond what humans attribute to them. So, if people define situations as real, then they will be real in their consequences. Individuals act based on their perceptions of the situation, and so prediction of the situation becomes true. One of the most prominent theorists to study the social exchange and symbolic interaction theory is Max Weber. That's the W pronounced as a V. Social action equals human behavior that has had subjective meaning attached to it and which takes into account the behavior of others. Using this approach must develop empathy for their subject of study. Next, in sociological approaches, we look at the structural functional theory. Emil Durkheim was one of the prominent experts in this field. Durkheim's definition of sociology is the study of social facts, which are external to the individual. These are constraining and limiting of what we can do. If we think about society based on the common sense approach to it, it only makes sense that looking at the structures within society are the ones that only allow us to do certain things that are acceptable to society and the people that make it up. Thus, society is composed of parts which retain their identity and the individuality of the person, while at the same time constituting a whole that is larger than its parts. Think about the fact here that group behavior provides internal strength and external cohesion if we're behaving as a single society. Also, looking at the structural functional theory, we have to think about the fact that society is a social system of interacting parts in which death related behavior is analyzed from two perspectives. How do death related meaning systems and death institutions contribute to maintenance of the larger social system? And in what ways are death related meaning systems and death institutions affected by the relationship to the larger social system? Continuing with the structural functional theory, we have eufunctional versus dysfunctional results of social interactions. Now, look at the way that those words are set up, and it makes sense what each is. First, eufunctional relies on the prefix eu, meaning good. Thus, eufunctional social interactions are interactions that result in a positive result. On the other hand, dysfunctional results, I think, gives us a more familiar or pardon me, a more familiar beginning. Dys To have dysfunctional results means that social interactions have led to a negative result. Following this, we have the opposition between manifest and latent consequences of death related behavior. Manifest consequences are the ones that were intended, latent consequences are the ones that were not intended. Sociologist Kathy Sharmaz talks about the fact that strategies used by coroner's deputies to get surviving family to take over care and disposal of a dead body means that if each individual performs a role, the social system runs and equilibrium is maintained. In this case, deputies lacked prestige relationship with survivor structural supports, resulting in the need to devise their own tactics to get the job done. These tactics include the avoidance of the word dead, hopefully leading to the relative's appreciation for sensitivity. They played the quote role of officials who cut through the survivor's grief and shock by pointing to the necessary work within a situation structured to foster acceptance of deputies' directives. Next, we have the conflicting conflict theory. I say conflicting because, of course, relies on a different interaction of people within society than the previous theory. The inequality of available medical care and the results of that are one of the main reasons that conflict theory can be helpful in looking at dying, death, and bereavement in America. Alan Kelly here talks about the fact that those who control life also control death. The power elite in any society thus determines one's life and death chances. Health insurance is one example of conflict theory in that the more economic resources one has, the better access they have to better health insurance. Whereas the opposite's also the case. The fewer economic resources one has, the less access they have to good health insurance and health care. What this means then is that the inherent conflict between those who have and those who have not is one of the structural dynamics of dying, death, and bereavement in America. Take a look at the questions on pages 31, 32 for additional ways of understanding what applying conflict theory in this subject area means. Next, looking at social exchange theory, a first tradition is consistent with principles of behavioral psychology and stresses, psychological reductionism, and behavioral enforcement techniques. Next, the second tradition of social exchange theory is influenced by the work of Peter Bloch. It is committed to assumptions held by social interaction theorists. Human behavior involves a subjective and interpretive interaction, with others that attempts to exchange symbolic and non-symbolic rewards. Reciprocity is important and necessary for the continued interaction of the individual with their social situation. As before, take a look at the questions that are on page 33 for a better understanding of what ways in which we might apply social exchange theory. According to social interaction theory, next, symbols are a basic component of human behavior. According to Turner, quote, symbols are the medium of our adjustment to the environment, of our interaction with others, of our interpretation of experiences, and of our organizing ourselves into groups. According to Christakis, self fulfilling prophecy in physician patient relationships is one piece or example of the way that social interaction works, particularly having to do with the exchange of symbols. Also, look at the ISAS statement that talks about the fact that individual or I level behavior is in response to symbols S relative to the audience A and relative to the situation S. Symbols are anything, to which socially created meaning is given. They can include language, colors, situation. Meaning is socially created and socially perpetuated. Words have to be rediscovered and reinterpreted if they are to be used in human interaction. Interaction is thus dynamic and constantly in flux. Audience related behavior has to do with what we do around friends, parents, grandparents, teachers, police officers, and any other group of people who tend to dictate a particular way of behaving both around them and towards them. Looking at social interaction theory, the situation is the next way of defining what it is to be surrounded by the various things that give meaning to aging, dying, and death. The definition of situation is an attempt to bring meaning to that very world. It always involves situational perception. The objective response does not have to have existence independent of one's perception, right? So part of the situation could very well be something that's been constructed by the consciousness of the person in question. Look to page 38 questions for indications of other ways of applying this particular theory.